The great hall of Valdenmoor smelled the way war smelled before the first arrow flew. Iron, ambition, and the sweet rot of too much mead. Torches lined the stone walls in rows of amber fire, throwing shadows long enough to swallow whole men. Outside, the fjords were howling. Inside, the lords of the northern reach would drinking themselves into alliances they would regret come dawn. I should not have been here. Not in the great hall. Not at the high table's edge with a cup of warmed mead pressed into my hand by a noblewoman who had whispered, "Drink, it makes the nobility bearable." With the practiced calm of someone who had survived 30 solstice gatherings, and who, having deposited the cup in my hands, had drifted away into the crowd and left me to my own poor judgment. I was Era of Skjalf, the 6th daughter of a minor jarl whose territory consisted primarily of windswept rock, too many sheep, and a harbor too shallow for proper trade ships. My presence here was purely ceremonial, a background figure in a room full of carved oak thrones and men whose names were etched into the old sagas. I had no business being bold, yet after the second refill, my shoulders had uncurled from their habitual apology, and the cold press of inadequacy had melted somewhere around the third cup into something that felt dangerously close to belonging. The gathering of Jarlkind happened once every 10 years, when all territories swore fealty anew and pledged their shields to the crown. It was tradition, ceremony, theater. I had spent the first 3 hours pressed against the eastern wall, watching everyone else navigate the intricate game of proximity to power. Watching who stood closest to the dais, watching who laughed too loudly and who did not laugh at all. It was near midnight when the mead made me reckless. I slipped through the great hall's rear doors and out into the stone passage that led to the northern courtyard. The old yard, they called it, where a well house stood over a spring that had never frozen in recorded history. The air here tasted of pine resin and distant snow. The stars above the courtyard walls were the kind that only appeared this far north, crystalline and merciless, so bright they seemed to ring like struck iron. The cold should have cleared my head. It did not. I heard him before I saw him, or rather, I heard his absence of sound, which was somehow louder than footsteps. The way a predator goes still in the underbrush, and the entire forest notices. He was standing at the well house wall, one shoulder braced against the old stone, looking north. Not toward the mountains. Toward them, past them, through them. The way men look when the thing they are searching for exists nowhere in the physical world. He wore no crown in the courtyard, no ceremonial furs, only dark wool and leather armor stripped of its decorative pieces, and a sword at his hip that had clearly been used beyond ceremony. He was tall in the way that the old standing stones were tall, not simply height, but mass, a presence that displaced the air around it. His profile in the torchlight was all sharp angles and hard planes, the architecture of his face carved rather than grown, too precise for accident. Dark hair, pushed back carelessly, a jaw that could have stopped a shield blow on its own. I did not know who he was. This, in my defense, was the mead's fault entirely. What I saw was a man performing solitude for an audience that had gone to bed. The deliberate set of the shoulders, the studied angle of the chin, the invisible mantle of "do not approach me," worn like a second cloak. I knew this performance. I had seen it at every gathering, every market day, every moment a man of middling pride needed to be seen, not needing anything. The brooding posture, the isolated silhouette, the carefully constructed mystique. Something in me, the mead, the dark, the particular exhaustion of being small in a large room for too many hours, found it unbearably, specifically funny. I walked toward him. My boots were soft against the courtyard stones, but he heard me anyway. I saw the slight shift in his shoulders, the minute adjustment of weight that said, "I know you are there," without the condescension of turning to look. "You know," I said to his profile, and my voice came out lighter than I intended, almost fond. "You are working very hard at that." A pause. At what? Not a question. A trap. The whole... I made a vague gesture with my mead cup that probably looked absurd. The brooding, the solitude, standing in the dark looking at mountains that cannot look back. It's a bit much. He turned his head then, just slightly, just enough that I caught the edge of his expression. His eyes were dark in the low light, the gray of deep water before a storm, the kind of color that could not decide between black and something older. "You are drunk," he said. "I am warm," I corrected. "There is a difference, and I am observing that you look like every bard's second favorite hero. The one who broods impressively in the first act and is eventually revealed to have feelings. It is a very well-established pattern." The silence that followed was not the silence of offense. It was something stranger, charged, as though I had thrown a stone into a pond and was now waiting to learn whether the pond was a pond at all or something with teeth. He turned fully. His eyes in the direct torchlight were gray-black, shot through with something that had not yet fully arrived, the color of an overcast sky with sun pressing insistently through it. His face, full on, was the kind that women painted on the prows of ships as prayers. Not handsome in the soft way of merchant sons. Handsome in the way cliffs are handsome, and river currents, and things that could kill you without meaning to. He looked at me the way a war commander looks at a map when an unexpected variable has appeared where there should be none. "A second favorite hero," he repeated. "The first favorite is always more cheerful," I said. "Better sense of humor." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger. Amusement, maybe, pressed under glass. "And what," he said very quietly, "do you imagine my reputation actually is?" I should have heard the warning in the question. I did, distantly, the way you hear the waterfall before you see it. "Oh, the usual. Terrifying. Unapproachable. Probably has some deep personal tragedy that explains the broodiness." I tilted my head. Men with reputations like yours are always either very boring or very frightened. I haven't decided which you are yet. The courtyard went very still. He moved. Not toward me, not exactly. More like around me. A single, smooth repositioning that put the well house wall behind me and himself between me and the passage back to the hall. He did not touch me. He did not need to. The geography of the space had changed in the space between one breath and the next, and I was suddenly acutely aware that I was standing in a dark courtyard with a man who had not yet told me his name. He was close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him through the cold night air. He smelled of pine smoke and leather and something mineral, like clean rock after rain. "Boring," he said, soft as a blade leaving its sheath. "Or frightened." His gaze dropped to my mouth for one fraction of a second, then back up. I felt it like a touch. "I will make you a challenge, Era of Skelf." I went still. "You know my name." "I know everyone's name." A pause, with something dangerous in it. "The question is whether you know mine. And I think—" He leaned in, not far, just enough that his voice could lower to the register that made the hairs on my arms stand. "I think you don't. And I think if you did, you would not have called me a cliché." I opened my mouth. "Don't apologize," he said immediately, and something flashed in his eyes, real, quick, almost like hunger. "It's the most interesting thing anyone has said to me in 6 years. I am making you a challenge because of it, not in spite of it." His breath was warm against the cold air between us. "Stay," he said. "Not in your Jarl's retinue, not as a background detail. Stay, and tell me in a fortnight whether you still believe the brooding is an act." He stepped back. The air where he had been standing was warmer than the rest of the night. "And if I refuse?" I managed. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. Something younger and more reckless that had not yet been fully extinguished, pressing at the surface for just a moment before he contained it again. "You won't," he said, and then he walked back toward the hall without another word. I stood in the courtyard alone, with my heartbeat and my cooling mead and the stars, watching from above like witnesses. A servant appeared in the passage doorway. She bowed very low and said, "My lady, I am to escort you to your guest quarters in the King's Wing." I turned. "The King's Wing?" "By order of King Valdric, my lady." The mead had completely worn off. King Valdric Ashvane, the Iron Wolf of the North, the youngest king the Northern Reach had seen in 3 centuries, the man every saga singer reached for when they needed a figure standing between the world's light and something hungry and nameless in the dark. I had called him a cliché. I followed the servant through the torchlit passage and tried very hard not to think about the way his eyes had dropped to my mouth. Day 2. I woke to silence and the smell of cedar. The room was not mine. This declared itself immediately. A guest chamber in the King's Wing, I reminded myself. The furs on the bed were deep brown wolf pelt. The window looked out not onto the fjord harbor I was accustomed to, but onto a vista of sheer granite and early snow so clean it hurt to look at. The furniture was good but unadorned, the walls bare save for a single iron sconce. A room for keeping someone near without ceremony. Someone had made a judgment, and I was not sure whether to be offended or oddly touched. Valdenmoor Fortress, King's Wing, the top of the world. I sat up, and the memory arrived all at once. The courtyard, the mead, the man against the well-house wall, and my own voice saying, "You're working very hard at that," to the most powerful man between the ice sea and the southern passes. I pressed my face into my hands. My clothes from the previous night had been replaced while I slept, not by court dress but by simple good wool, the kind that worked rather than displayed. I moved to the door. It opened, not locked. The knowledge settled something in my chest that I hadn't realized was clenched. A guard stood in the corridor, young, armed, wearing the gray wolf insignia of the king's household. He bowed slightly. "The king requests your presence in the archive hall at the 9th hour, my lady. I am to escort you at your convenience." "The archive hall," I repeated. "His Majesty believes you may be useful to the royal archivist. He said you seem the type who reads." I thought about refusing. I thought about demanding a horse and an escort back to my father's harbor. I thought about many things. Then I thought about gray-black eyes going still in the courtyard darkness, and the voice that had said, "It's the most interesting thing anyone has said to me in 6 years," with something so raw and unguarded in it that it hadn't sounded like a king at all. "I will be ready by the 9th hour," I said. The archive hall occupied an entire wing of the fortress's upper level, long, cold, smelling wonderfully of old vellum and wax. Shelves of bound manuscripts stretched floor to ceiling on both sides, interspersed with wooden chests of scrolled records and the occasional relic wrapped in treated cloth. King Valdric was already there when I arrived. He stood at the long center table with his back to the door, unrolling a large map weighted at its corners by inkstones. He had shed the formal tokens of rank, no crown, no ceremonial cloak. The shirt beneath his jerkin was plain dark linen, open at the throat, and his hair, without the careful arrangement of court presentation, had fallen loose across his forehead, in a way that made him look somehow younger and more dangerous at once. He did not turn when I entered. "You stayed," he said. "Your guard was very persuasive." I told him to tell you the door was unlocked. Still not turning. "Did he?" "Yes." "Then you stayed because you chose to." He turned then, leaning back against the table's edge with his arms folded, regarding me with that stillness I was beginning to understand was not coldness, but concentration. His eyes in daylight were more complex than they had been in the courtyard dark, a color I was going to spend time thinking about against my better judgment. "Sit down, Era of Skelv. Tell me why you called me a cliché." I sat. I folded my hands on the table like I was calm. "I didn't know who you were." "That," he said, "is what I find interesting. Everyone else here has known who I am since before they could walk. They arrived at this gathering with 20 years of stories about me already written, and they behave accordingly. You arrived and saw a man standing in the dark looking self-important." I was impolite. You were honest. Something shifted in his expression, brief, almost imperceptible, like a window opened and immediately closed. It has been some time since someone was honest with me who had nothing to gain from it. We looked at each other across the archive table. I'm still not certain you're not simply a very skilled performer, I said. This could all be an elaborate brooding routine with extra steps. He made a sound, not quite dismissal, not quite agreement, and turned back to the map. Come here, he said. I'll show you the border dispute that's going to trigger the next conflict if no one addresses it in the next 2 months. Tell me what you see that I'm missing. I came. I looked at the map. I told him. He listened without interrupting, which was the first surprise. When I finished, he said, "The 4th point, about the grain road. Expand on it." So I did. By the time the archive's small iron stove had burned down to coals, we had been talking for 4 hours, and the mountain light through the high windows had gone from gold to gray. At some point, tea had appeared, brought by someone neither of us had heard enter, and my cup had been refilled without my noticing. At some point, the formal distance across the table had narrowed as we both leaned over the maps, and I had become aware that his forearm was resting very close to mine on the vellum edge, that if I shifted my hand a few inches, our fingers would be parallel. I did not shift my hand. He did not shift his. But neither of us moved away. Days 3 through 7. Days in the archive became a rhythm, a strange domestic architecture erected in the middle of a fortress full of watchful eyes. I arrived at the 9th hour. He was always already there. We worked, because the work was real, I discovered quickly. The border maps needed reading, the grain road treaties needed analysis. The old Norse writs in the locked chest under the east shelf needed translating, and I, who had learned my letters from a wandering monk and spent my childhood in a library that consisted of 14 books and a donkey my father swore could read, turned out to be better at them than anyone else in the fortress. Valdric rarely complimented. He responded, which was different, and somehow more. Yes, continue. What does the 3rd clause imply about the original negotiation? He listened to my answers with the complete attention of someone who had learned early that information was the only resource that never ran dry, and his focus had weight, the sensation of being the only object in a room. I watched him in those hours the way you watch a fire, the information gathering itself almost against your will. He was meticulous and impatient at once. He would spend an hour on a single paragraph of treaty language, and then impatiently wave off a ceremonial request from his steward that had clearly taken the man 3 days to prepare. He thought faster than he spoke, which meant his silences were not empty, but working, and when he finally said something, it arrived already complete. He did not posture with me. He did not perform patience or perform interest. When he was interested, the quality of his stillness changed, sharpened, the way a compass needle moves toward north without being asked. It took me several days to understand that this was unusual, that the man described in the sagas had never once, in anyone else's account, simply sat across a table and asked questions and listened to the answers. I began to notice other things too, involuntarily, the way you begin to notice the sound of a particular voice in a crowded room. The way his hand moved when he was thinking, a slow turn of the quill between his fingers, back and forth, that stopped the moment he arrived at a conclusion. The way he drank his tea without tasting it, always going cold before he remembered it. The way he carried a stillness that the rest of the fortress seemed to organize itself around. The guards standing a fraction straighter as he passed, the servants timing their movements to the rhythm of his. The whole stone building attuned to him the way a forest is attuned to weather. And the way, occasionally, rarely, briefly, he looked at me when he thought I was not watching. Not with the predatory assessment of the first night, not with the sharp curiosity of those first archive hours. Something quieter. The look of a man doing arithmetic he has not yet decided he wants the answer to. I never acknowledged it, but I felt it each time like a hand pressed briefly to glass. Present, warm, and then gone. There was also Commander Halvard, Valdric's most senior officer, a broad-shouldered man of middle years who appeared in the archive doorway most afternoons with dispatches that could not wait. He had served the Ashvane throne for longer than the current king had been alive, and there was something in the careful way he looked between Valdric and myself, not suspicious, not judgmental, that told me he was the kind of man who noticed things and said nothing until saying something was the only option left. I filed this observation away. On the 5th day, Valdric's hand shook while signing a correspondence. It was subtle, a fine tremor that traveled through the tendons of his right hand as he pressed the seal, sending the wax slightly off-center. He noticed me noticing. His jaw went hard. He set the seal down very deliberately and looked back at the correspondence as though it were the correspondence that had made the error. I said nothing. I got up, went to the small cabinet where the kitchen girl left our morning things, and poured water from the pitcher into a cup. I walked back and set it at the edge of his workspace, not in front of him, not presented as care, just placed, available. He looked at it for a long moment. "It's been 3 days since I've slept more than 2 hours," he said, not an explanation, something else. "I know," I said. His gaze came up quickly, sharpened. "You go to the battlements at night," I said. "I have the room below the eastern tower. I can hear the pacing." A long silence, the kind that had weight. "No one has ever mentioned that," he said. "No one wants to know about it," I said. "There's a difference." His hand was still on the table near the water cup, fingers loose, the tremor gone now, but its memory still in the set of his wrist. I was acutely aware of how close my hand was to his, of the space between them, 2 inches, 3, and how much it would cost to close it, and what it might mean if I did. I didn't. He picked up the cup, drank. "Tomorrow," he said, "I want your reading of the Hartvin Accords, the original, not the council's summary." "The original is in High Norse." "I'm aware. Can you read it?" "With a lexicon." "There's one on the 3rd shelf, left side." He was already looking back at his correspondence when he added, very quietly, "Thank you, Era." 2 words, plainly spoken, no performance in them. My heart did something I chose not to examine. Day 8. The solstice feast arrived like a siege. The entire fortress was transformed in 3 days. Tapestries brought down from the upper storerooms, additional torches mounted in every corridor, the kitchens working in continuous shifts that filled the whole mountain with the smell of spiced meat and pine honey. Jarls and their retinues who had remained at the gathering swelled the great hall to capacity, and the noise of it reached even the archive wing's upper rooms. I was summoned by Aldous, the king's head steward, a narrow woman with the efficient composure of a siege commander, and informed that I would be attending as part of the king's inner household. "I am a minor Jarl's 6th daughter," I said. "You are also the only person in this fortress who has had a daily audience with the king for 8 consecutive days," Aldous said, without inflection. "The court has noticed. Presentation matters. The king's honor matters." A pause with something that might, in another woman, have been kindness. "He asked that you not be made uncomfortable." He did not specify further. The dress they brought was the color of winter water, blue-gray like the deep fjord before it freezes, silk over wool underlayers so that the warmth was hidden inside the cold. The embroidery at the collar and cuffs was silver thread, restrained rather than elaborate, which was exactly right. Someone had made a judgment about what I would want to wear, and they had been correct. I descended the main stair into the great hall with my heart doing something loud and undignified behind my ribs. He was at the hall's far end, speaking to 2 of his senior commanders. He wore formal black with gray wolf fur at the collar, the iron crown on his head. Not gold, never gold for Valdric Ashvane. Always iron. Always the king of the hard rock north. He was visibly performing his public self, controlled, authoritative, the deliberate stillness that the court took for coldness. He looked up when I reached the last stair. The distance between us was the length of the entire great hall. Through the crowd, through the torchlight, through the careful architecture of his public face, he looked up, and there was a moment, brief as a held breath, when something in his expression moved that had nothing to do with the performance. Not a smile, not surprise, something quieter and more volatile, the way a banked fire moves when the door opens and a thin stream of cold air finds it. His commander said something. Valdric answered, his gaze already elsewhere. He met me at the foot of the stair, not with ceremony, not formally, not with the deliberate staging a court appearance required. Simply, he moved through the crowd and arrived beside me with the directness of a man who had decided where he was going and declined to apologize for it. "You look," he began. He stopped. I had never heard him stop mid-sentence. "Unfamiliar," he finished, but his eyes did not say unfamiliar. His eyes said something my blood understood before my mind had time to translate it. "I am still me," I said. "Still the girl who called you a cliché." "I know." He offered his arm, formal, court-correct, nothing in it that anyone watching could object to. "Come, there's someone you need to be seen talking to before the council starts making inferences they'll act on." His arm under my hand was a different thing than the map table between us. Warm, solid. The muscle beneath the wool moved as he walked, and I was suddenly very conscious of the layers of propriety between my fingers and his skin. The wool, the linen of his shirt, all of it a deliberate and insufficient distance. "You're doing it again," I said, quietly enough that only he could hear. "What?" "The protective brooding. Useful variant this time." He made a low sound in his chest. Short, involuntary, and immediately swallowed. But it had been there. I filed it away alongside the water cup and the grain road treaty and all the other small, precise things I was learning about him without permission. At the edge of the feast floor, we paused near the great stone hearth. The fire threw warmth across his profile, and in it his face was less carved than usual. The hard lines softened fractionally, the way ice softens closest to a flame. He bent his head slightly toward mine to say something about the Eastern Jarl I was meant to speak with, and his lips were close enough to my temple that I felt the warmth of his breath before I heard the words. I catalogued that too, traitorously. The evening passed in its careful theater. We spoke to the Jarl and then a visiting commander, and then a woman whose name I did not catch but whose eyes were sharp and measuring as she looked between us. Valdric performed his public self for all of them, controlled, authoritative, that deliberate stillness, and the whole time, when the conversation permitted, his hand was at the small of my back, guiding, saying nothing aloud that could be objected to, saying everything else. There was a moment, near the middle of the feast, when a servant passed too close with the tray and I stepped back instinctively, directly into him. His arm came around my waist without hesitation, catching me, and for 3 seconds I was held against his chest, with his heartbeat against my shoulder, steady and fast, a combination I found unexpectedly arresting. He released me immediately. We both looked elsewhere. "Apologies," I said, to the floor. "No," he said, to the middle distance. "Don't." I was not certain what he meant. I chose not to ask. But I could feel the exact shape of where his arm had been for the rest of the evening, a warmth that persisted like an impression in wax. Day 10. I found the book on a gray midweek morning in the rain. Not a remarkable day otherwise. I had been working through the locked chest under the east shelf, the one that held records so old the vellum was nearly transparent, when my fingers found a false bottom. The space beneath held a single bound volume, smaller than my hand, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved it through what looked like several centuries. The writing inside was rune script, pre-kingdom, the kind that only half a dozen scholars in the northern reach could read with any confidence. I was one of them. Again, 14 books, one literate donkey, a monk with unusual priorities. What the book described was not a legend I had encountered before. It concerned something called the Sather Curse, a dark working laid upon a bloodline, generation to generation, that expressed in the afflicted as a progressive severance from reason. Not madness exactly. More like an erosion of the self, the way water erodes stone. Slowly, invisibly, until one day the weight becomes too much. The curse fed on isolation, It grew stronger when the afflicted pushed people away. And the only thing that could arrest it, not cure it, arrest it, was a chosen bond. A witness. Someone who stayed. I sat with the book in my lap for a long time. I thought about the sleepless nights, the trembling hand, the 6 years since anyone had been honest with him. I thought about what it meant that he had, on the night of our meeting, made me a challenge that consisted entirely of stay. I was still sitting there when the door opened. It was not Valdric. It was Lady Brynhild, one of the High Council's senior members, silver-haired and elegant, and standing in the doorway with the composed stillness of someone who had been waiting outside for some time. Her eyes went to the book in my hands. Her expression did not change, but something in it crystallized. "That text," she said, "is restricted by council order." "I found it in the archive," I said. "Under the king's own documents. Nevertheless." She stepped inside. Her gaze moved over me, cataloging. "You have spent a great deal of time in the king's company, Lady Era. The court has been discussing your position. I assist with the archive work." She sat, uninvited, in the chair across from me. "You know what you are holding. I can see it in your face. I want you to understand something before you do anything reckless with that information." She folded her hands. "King Valdric is a powerful man and a good king. He is also a man with a deteriorating condition that 3 generations of council have been managing very carefully. The balance is fragile. If something disrupts it—" "You mean someone," I said. A pause. "I mean the stakes are not personal," Brynhild said. "They are political. They are survival. You are a girl from a minor holding with good instincts and an unusual education. Those are not qualifications for what you are considering." "What am I considering?" She looked at me for a long moment. There was something in her eyes that was not entirely unkind. The look of a woman who has spent years moving pieces on a board and has just encountered a piece that moved itself. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's what I need to determine." She left. I looked at the book. I thought about the word considering. I thought about what it would mean to choose something rather than be moved toward it. Day 12. The storm arrived from the northwest without warning. I heard it first as a sound through the stone walls, a sound like 1,000 hands pressing against the fortress from outside, the wind off the ice sea finding every gap and crack and screaming through them. The torches in the corridor guttered. The windows in my room shook in their frames. I was already awake. I had been awake since the 2nd hour, when the pacing in the tower room above mine had started and then suddenly stopped. The silence after pacing stops is worse than the pacing. I wrapped my wool robe around myself and went up the stairs. The tower room was in disarray. Not by outside violence. The desk had been overturned. Several books from the shelf had fallen to the floor, their pages spread open like wounded birds. One of the iron candle holders had struck the far wall with force enough to leave a mark in the stone. The window was open to the storm, the shutters beating against the frame, snow coming in on the wind and lying in a thin white line across the flagstones. Valdric was sitting on the floor with his back against the far wall and his hands over his face. He was dressed. That was the first thing I processed. He had been trying to work or had come here to be alone, and something had broken through. The king of the Hard Rock North was sitting on a cold floor in a disordered room with a storm coming in the window, and his shoulders were moving with the effort of controlled breathing. I did not speak. I crossed the room, stepped over the fallen books, and pushed the shutters closed against the wind. I latched them. My palm caught the edge of the iron latch, sharp, corroded, and I felt the sting of it across 3 fingers. I ignored it. I picked up the nearest candle from the floor, used the small flint on the desk ledge to relight it, and set it on the window ledge. Then I sat on the floor, not in front of him, not at touching distance. Close enough that when he finally lowered his hands and opened his eyes, I was there in his peripheral vision, visible and quiet. The candle threw warm light across the side of his face. His eyes, when he turned his head to look at me, were exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep deprivation. They were gray-black and enormous in the dim light, and there was something in them that he was clearly not accustomed to anyone seeing. The edges of something that had been held too long. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was rougher than usual, not threatening, just rough. "I heard the pacing stop," I said. A long silence. The storm beat at the shutters. "The book," he said, not a question. "Yes." He leaned his head back against the stone wall and looked at the ceiling. The lines of his throat, his jaw, his neck, tense and then, slowly, fractionally, letting go. Then his eyes dropped to my hand. I had forgotten about the cut. 3 thin lines across my palm, dark in the candlelight, still beating slowly. "You're bleeding," he said. Flat. Not alarmed. Controlled, but attention suddenly entirely elsewhere. "It's nothing, the latch." He was already moving. He crossed to the overturned desk, righted it with one hand as though it weighed nothing, and pulled open the lower drawer. A cloth folded clean. A small jar of rendered fat and pine resin, the kind every fortress kept for exactly this kind of small injury. He brought them back and sat beside me, not across from me, beside, close enough that his knee pressed against mine, and picked up my hand without asking. His grip was careful. Both hands wrapped around mine, one holding my wrist steady and the other unfolding my fingers to see the damage. His touch was very deliberate, the way it is when someone is concentrating hard on being gentle. He pressed the cloth to my palm. The sting flared and I made an involuntary sound. "Hold still," he said. I held still. His head was bent over my hand, dark hair falling forward, and I could see the angle of his jaw from above, the faint movement of the muscles there, the way his breathing was very controlled and very careful. The candle flickered. The storm continued outside. In here, there was only the close circle of candlelight and the specific warmth of his hands around mine. He worked slowly. Applied the pine resin with 2 fingers, smoothed it with a touch so precise it barely registered as pressure, and yet left a trail of heat along each cut. Wound the cloth strip over and around, tied it with a small tight knot at the base of my thumb. When it was done, he did not immediately release my hand. His fingers remained loosely curled around mine, the cloth bandage between us, and the silence stretched in a way that had texture. Not the comfortable silence of the archive, not the charged silence of the courtyard. Something newer and more careful. He was looking at my wrapped hand and thinking something he had not decided yet whether to say. "How long have you known about the curse?" I asked quietly. "Since I was 15. My father had it. His father before him. They called it the Iron Madness because no one had a better name for it. The council's solution has always been management. Strategic marriages to women chosen for political value. None of them stayed long enough to matter." His voice was flat, factual, telling me what the records said rather than what they meant. His thumb moved once across my knuckles, so briefly I might have imagined it. "The book says a chosen bond can hold it back," I said. "A chosen bond." His gaze came up from my hand and found mine. In the candlelight, his eyes held something very old and very careful. Not an arranged one. Not a diplomatic one. A bond the afflicted person doesn't control and can't compel. Which means a bond I can't ask for, because asking is compulsion. Which means, he stopped. "Which means you made me a challenge," I said, and waited to see if I'd stay. He said nothing, but the muscle in his jaw moved. "You were going to let the curse take you," I said. Rather than ask someone to help you who didn't know what they were agreeing to, still nothing. The silence had the quality of something held closed by will for a very long time. I did not pull my hand back. He did not release it. We sat there on the cold floor while the storm pressed against the shutters. He turned my bandaged hand over in both of his very slowly, the way you turn over something fragile. And then, as though he had only just noticed what he was doing and had decided, quietly, not to stop. He held it. Just that. Just held it. I could feel his pulse against my wrist, slow and very steady, the way a great stone is steady. Not unmovable, just accustomed to bearing weight. The candle threw one last pulse of warmth and then guttered to a thread of smoke. In the darkness he was a shape and a warmth and the sound of breathing that had, sometime in the past hour, forgotten to be controlled. "The curse," I said, very quietly, "feeds on isolation." "Yes." "Then we should stop practicing it." His hand tightened once around mine, brief, involuntary, the grip of a man who has been cold for a long time and has just been handed something warm and does not quite believe it won't be taken back. He said nothing. The candle burned down to nothing. We stayed. Day 15. The storm lasted 3 days. Valdric did not summon me back to the archive. I did not seek the archive. We existed, instead, in the strange interval between things, passing each other in the fortress corridors with an awareness that had changed its frequency, like a string tuned to a new note. His gaze found mine across the great hall's supper seating with the particular precision of a man who knows exactly where something is at all times and has stopped pretending he doesn't. He passed my door once in the night and stopped, not entering, not knocking. And I lay in my bed and listened to the specific silence of a person standing on the other side of wood and choosing, and then walking away. On the 3rd day of the storm, I found Brynhild waiting in my room. She was sitting in the chair by the window, hands folded, composed in the way of someone who has spent years making herself unreadable while reading everyone else. "Close the door," she said. I closed it. "I was not honest with you in the archive," she said. "I told you the council stakes were political. That is true. I did not tell you the full nature of those stakes. I needed to know, first, what you would do with the book, whether you would use it as leverage or as information." She looked out the window toward the frozen courtyard. "You did neither. You went to the tower room and sat on the floor with him in the dark." A pause. Not quite approval, but something adjacent. That told me what I needed to know. The room was very quiet. "There are 3 members of the High Council who are not attempting to manage the king's condition," she continued. "They are feeding it." "Dark working," she said. "Introduced through the king's food and environment over the past 2 years. The share curse in his bloodline makes him vulnerable to amplification. If the curse can be pushed to its final stage during the eclipse of Solmunda, which occurs in 11 days, the king will be stripped of his reason. He will be controlled. He will be a weapon pointed wherever they choose." "Who?" "Jarl Commander Ulfrin, High Speaker Dagger, and Lady Winda of the Eastern Passes." She said the names with the precision of someone who has rehearsed them many times, in darkness, alone. "I have documentation. It means nothing without a witness who can corroborate testimony to the king directly." Her eyes came back to mine. "Without being dismissed as factional maneuvering. Without someone whose credibility is unassailable precisely because they have no political stake. A 6th daughter from a minor holding with a shallow harbor and 14 books. "You need me," I said. "The king needs you," Brynhild said. "That is different." She stood. "There is another complication. Lady Winda has become aware of your time with him. She is planning to use it. She will tell him that you were placed in the archive deliberately, that you are my instrument, not an independent witness, that your presence here was orchestrated from the beginning to compromise his judgment. Tonight, she will make her move." I found him on the battlements. Of course I did. The battlements, the courtyard well house, the archive in the dark. The man had a predictable relationship with heights and cold air and solitude, and I had learned its geography by heart over 15 days. He heard me coming. He always heard me coming. "Lady Wenda has been speaking to you," I said, before he could turn. A long pause. "She said you were placed in my household by Brynhild's arrangement, that your presence here was not coincidence. Do you believe that?" He turned. His face was very still. "I believe," he said carefully, "that Brynhild may have noticed what you were before I did. I believe she may have ensured you were at the gathering in a position to come to my attention." He paused. "I don't believe you were her instrument. Brynhild doesn't control things by telling them what to do. She puts pieces in proximity and sees what develops." "Then what are you asking me?" The battlements were cold in the early dark, the stars above us that same merciless ring of northern light. His eyes in the starlight were gray-black and unreadable, and he was holding himself with the particular stillness of a man waiting for news he needs to hear and does not want to receive. "I am asking," he said slowly, "whether any of it was real." The question landed in my chest like something dropped from a height. I thought about the archive table and the gap between our hands that neither of us had closed. I thought about the tower room floor and his hands wrapped around mine and the specific length of time he had held on. I thought about 6 years and a book in a locked chest and the edge of something younger that came and went behind his eyes. "The mead wore off in the courtyard on the first night," I said. "I called you a cliché when I was warm and reckless. I stayed the next morning when I was completely sober and you were not performing anything." I looked at him directly. "You want to know if it was real? Ask me something I couldn't answer if it weren't." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "What does my laugh sound like?" I blinked. "What?" "I am told I don't laugh. I have been told this since childhood. My own household does not know what it sounds like. If you have been in my presence long enough to know me rather than know of me, you would know." I thought about the archive table and a badly translated treaty clause and the low involuntary sound he had made before he caught himself. Short, swallowed, almost angry at itself. "It sounds like you're furious at yourself for doing it," I said. Low, short, like a door that opened before you got to the latch. The silence on the battlement stretched long and full. He crossed the distance between us in 2 steps, and his hand came up to the side of my face. Not gripping, not the charged geometry of the courtyard on that first night, but something entirely different. His fingers along my jaw, palm against my cheek, his thumb resting just below my cheekbone, tilting my face up to his with the careful deliberateness of someone who is afraid of breaking something they have only just admitted they want. His forehead came down to rest against mine. We stood like that, foreheads touching, the cold air between us full of heat, his breathing audible and unsteady and completely unlike the controlled stillness the court received. "I have 11 days, he said, "before the eclipse." "I know," I said. "Brynhild told me. She has documentation." A pause. "Of course she does." Something almost fond in his voice, which was extraordinary. "Will you testify?" "Yes." "It will make you a target." "I'm already a target." I pulled back just enough to look at him, at the gray-dark eyes and the tired lines around them, and that sound from the archive, so close to the surface now I could almost hear it. "You said at the beginning that you wanted someone who would tell you the truth when there was nothing to gain from it." "Yes." "I am telling you the truth. I'm not a remedy. I'm not an instrument. I'm a 6th daughter from a minor holding who called you a cliché because you look like you needed it, and I stayed because you turned out to be worth staying for." I held his gaze. "Now tell me about the eclipse so we can do something about it." His thumb moved against my cheek, barely anything, a breath of a movement, the kind that pretends it isn't happening. "You are," he said, very quietly, "going to be the end of me, era of Skjelv." "Or the beginning of something else," I said. His mouth moved, not quite a smile, something younger and more reckless pressing at the surface for just a moment, and this time he let it stay a little longer before he contained it again. "We had 11 days, and we used them. Brynhild's documentation was meticulous, the records of purchases made outside normal supply channels, logs of access to the king's personal kitchens, the testimony of a kitchen boy she had been protecting for 6 months who had seen Lady Wenda in the lower corridors on a night she had claimed to be ill. I corroborated. Brynhild's word alone would be dismissed as factional. Mine, from a girl with no political alliance and a reputation for an uncomfortable directness, stood on different ground. We laid the evidence before Commander Halvard. He read it without expression, the lamp between us throwing deep shadows under his brow, and the only sound in the room was the wind outside and the occasional turn of a page. He asked 2 precise questions. The first was about the timing of Wenda's access to the kitchens. The second was about the source of the room text book and how I had identified it as relevant. I answered both without embellishment. He looked at me for a long moment over the documents, the same measuring look I had seen him give dispatches from unreliable commanders, calibrating weight and reliability. "He trusts you," Halvard said, not an accusation, a fact that he was adjusting his understanding around, fitting it into the shape of things as he knew them. "I haven't given him reason not to," I said. A pause. Something shifted in Halvard's expression. Not warmth exactly, but the particular respect of a man who has served a difficult post for a long time and has learned to recognize the specific quality of someone willing to stand in an uncomfortable place without flinching. He gathered the documents. "I'll take it to him," he said. Halvard took it to the king. I was not there for that meeting. I was in the archive, translating, telling myself that my hands were not shaking, and that the persistent awareness of where in the fortress Valdric was at any given moment was simply spatial competence and not something else entirely. He came to the archive at the end of that day and stood in the doorway for a moment before he came in. He looked tired in a different way than usual, not the erosion of the curse, but the specific exhaustion of a man who has just confirmed something he feared was true about people he had trusted for years. "Halvard is handling the 3, he said. "They will be confined and tried after the eclipse." And the working they've been doing to the curse. Brynhild believes stopping the amplification will allow the natural state to stabilize. It will not remove the underlying condition. The bloodline carries it. My father had it. My son, if I have one, will have it. He said if I have one, the way you say something, you have decided not to want, because wanting it requires believing in a future. "The book says the bond has to be chosen," I said, "not arranged." He was very still. "I know what the book says," he said. "I'm choosing," I said. The archive was very quiet. Outside, the 11th day sky had gone the particular shade of iron gray that preceded snow, and the light through the high windows was flat and even and oddly tender. The kind of light that makes everything look like something worth keeping. He crossed to the table. He did not sit across from me the way he had for weeks. He sat beside me, a conscious repositioning, the same geometry as the tower room floor, rendered now in daylight without the cold or the crisis to justify it. He reached across and turned my hand over, palm up, on the table. He looked at it for a moment, at the bandage, still wrapped, slightly looser now after several days. He touched the edge of it with his thumb. Then he set his hand in mine, fingers interlacing with a quiet and unhurried deliberateness that said this was not an accident and he was not going to pretend it was. The warmth of it traveled up my arm and settled somewhere it was going to stay. Neither of us said anything. Neither of us needed to. The eclipse of Solmund came and passed. Ulfrin, Dagger, and Wenda were confined the night before it, and the dark-worked amplification that had been feeding Valdric's curse for 2 years unraveled slowly. The way smoke unravels when the fire is removed from it, not all at once, not cleanly, but receding. Halvard sent me a brief note that morning. "It is done. He is sleeping." 3 words had never carried so much. He slept the night of the eclipse, nearly 15 hours, which Halvard reported to me the next morning with the particular gravity of a man who had been watching for signs of this for 6 years and had not dared to expect it. I sat in the archive and translated, and let myself feel something I had been carefully not feeling for a fortnight and more. He came to the archive the morning after, and he looked different. Not younger, that would be too simple. Lighter, perhaps, like a pack set down after a long march, the posture remembering gradually what it meant to stand without that particular weight. He sat beside me. He had been doing this since the battlements, and I had not commented on it and did not intend to. Brynhild is calling for a formal council reformation, he said. Yes, I know. She asked my opinion on the composition. He looked at me. She asked a sixth daughter from a minor holding for her political opinion. She asked the person who has been translating your border treaties for a month, I said, and who has apparently demonstrated some capacity for judgment under pressure. Apparently. His knee was touching mine under the table. This was new, or new in daylight, without a storm or a tower room to explain it. He had not moved. I had not moved. I have been thinking, he said carefully, about what kind of future is possible for a king with a heritable curse and a troublesome bloodline. Troublesome is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. The bond the book describes requires ongoing choice, not a single decision, but a continued one. Every day, for as long as... He paused. That is a significant thing to ask of someone. You're not asking, I said. You said in the courtyard that you wouldn't ask. You said you'd make a challenge. His gaze came up from the table. I stayed, I said. I stayed past the mead, and past the morning, and past a fortnight of treason, and a storm, and a tower room floor, and a council that wanted to use me as a weapon. I held his gaze. I think the challenge has been answered. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was very low and had something in it that was nothing like the controlled stillness the court received. You called me a cliché in a dark courtyard, and I thought, for the first time in years, that something had arrived that I hadn't anticipated, that I couldn't predict or control or manage at a careful distance. A pause. You asked me that first night whether I was boring or frightened. I've been thinking about my answer. And? Frightened, he said. Specifically, and only, of this. Something caught in my chest and held. He reached up and tucked a strand of my hair back from my face with the concentrated care of someone handling something they have only recently decided they are allowed to want. His fingers traced the line of my jaw, my cheekbone, slowly. The way cartographers trace a new coastline, as though memorizing it for a future in which he might need to find his way back. You asked me in the beginning, I said quietly, to tell you, after a fortnight, whether the brooding was an act. Here is my answer, a few days late. I turned my palm up on the table, the way he had turned it that afternoon. It is not an act, it is armor, and you don't need to wear it here. He looked at my hand for a long moment. Then he set his in mine. Outside, the first real snow of winter had begun to fall. Not the storm's violence, but the quiet kind. The kind that falls straight down in the deep cold of the north, covering the old stones of Valdenmoor with something clean and without history. Inside the archive, the iron stove had warmed the room to something comfortable, and the old vellum smelled of centuries and continuance, and the king of the northern reach had found, in the face of everything, the particular expression the court had never seen, and that I was learning to read like a language with only a few words, but all of them essential. We sat like that for a moment, his hand in mine, the snow outside, the archive full of old things and new ones, and I thought about the courtyard and the mead and the woman I had been that night, too warm and too tired of being small, walking up to a man standing in the dark and telling him the truth because no one else was going to. I thought about what it had cost him to not ask, to make a challenge instead of a demand, to leave the door unlocked and wait to see if I would choose to walk through it, knowing that if I didn't, he would say nothing and simply carry it, the way he had been carrying everything else, alone on the battlements in the hours before dawn. I thought about the book and the word witness and how it was the simplest and most irreversible thing in the world to be. Someone who sees and stays and says, I know, and I'm here. You know, I said into the quiet, for a man with a reputation for being terrifying, you are remarkably easy to read, once you know where to look. He turned his head to look at me. His eyes, in the soft gray snowlight from the windows, were the color of deep water. Not before a storm, not any longer. Just deep. And still. And full of something that had stopped hiding. "Only for you," he said. It was 3 words, and they were not sweet-spoken, and he said them in the flat, factual tone he used for treaty clauses and border disputes. But they landed in my chest like something permanent, like a nail driven in clean, set for keeping. His forehead came to rest against mine. "Stay," he said, quietly. And this time, it was not a challenge. This time, it was something else entirely. The voice of a man who has set the armor down, just here, just for now, and is finding the air on the other side of it unexpectedly breathable. "I already am," I said, and outside the snow fell, and the north held its breath, and the thing that had lived behind his eyes, pressed under glass, pressing back, something younger and more reckless and not quite extinguished, finally, quietly, came all the way through. And that, dear listeners, is where we leave Era of Skjelv and King Valdrik Ashvane, not at the end of their story, but at the beginning of the one they're choosing together. If you've been with us from the courtyard to the archive to the tower room floor, thank you. Truly. Drop a comment and tell me your favorite moment. Were you Team Era from the first mead-warmed insult? Or did the archive days win you over? Don't forget to like and follow so you never miss a new chapter. Until next time, stay warm and keep listening.